I'm Patrick Byers, Horticulture Field Specialist with University of Missouri Extension. It has been a fabulous year for the onions in my garden. I'm so excited about how well they've grown, and in fact, I think I might have the best onions in the state of Missouri. Well, if that's the case, then I need to share how well I've done with my onions, and a great way to do that is to display these onions, and in fact to display fruits and vegetables at your local county or at your regional or your state fair. Today we're going to talk about how to do that effectively. The first step in developing an effective display at the fair is to do a good job of growing the fruit or vegetable. Make sure that you prepare your garden site well. Make sure that you choose the right cultivar. University of Missouri Extension has publications to help you in making that decision. Plant at the proper time, plant at the proper density, and do a good job of growing the fruit or the vegetable. In other words, do a good job of cultivating it. Make sure that you keep weeds under control. Keep an eye out for insects and diseases. And then harvest those fruits or those vegetables at the optimum stage of quality so that you can develop an effective display at the fair. So if your goal is to have the award-winning onions at the fair, it's very important, of course, to do a good job of growing the onions, and we've nurtured this crop along, but it's also important to harvest them at the right stage and handle them very carefully from that point, so that when it's time to display them, they'll be in tip-top shape. So our onion crop is beginning to lay over. The necks on the onions are starting to dry out, and that's our signal that it's time to dig the onions. And I'm very excited by the size and quality of these onions, so we're going to be handling them very carefully at this point. So let's go ahead and dig some of these beautiful onions up. And again, we're going to focus on those where the necks have laid over. That's a good sign that these onions are ready to harvest. Oh, look at that. What a beautiful onion. My goodness. And here's another excellent onion. I think these are definitely first prize winners, or at least first prize quality. So we'll go ahead and pull these onions out. Now, onions have to be cured so that they're ready for storage. And normally when we would dig onions, we would let them cure in the garden. We would just lay them out and they would cure in the sunshine. But for a onion that we want to display in the fair, it's got to be perfect. It's got to be as close to perfection as possible. So we are going to cure these in an area out of the sun so we don't have to worry about sunburn. And we're also going to cure them in a place where they're not going to get rained upon or anything else that might damage the appearance of the onions. So I will dig them and I'll lay them in my tray here. And again, I'm handling these very carefully. And we'll go ahead and dig some more here. Oh my goodness, look at that beautiful, beautiful onion. And again, we're being careful not to damage the outer skins on these onions, because that will become part of the final display of these onions as we get them ready for actually taking to the fair. So again, we'll place them in our flat here. And when I lay them in the next layer, and I'll lay them like this so that the bulbs are up and so they can quickly dry. This particular lug has a perforated bottom so that there'll be good air movement around these bulbs. And we'll let them dry down till the leaves are completely brown and the necks are completely sealed over. Then we'll go through, we'll sort them out, and we'll pick out the absolute 4 best onions for our display at the fair. Several weeks have passed since we harvested the onions. We've laid them out, they've dried beautifully, and it looks like we have the makings for an award-winning entry at the fair. Now, the first step in developing an entry for a fair is to obtain a copy of the premium book or the rules that regulate the various entries. And we've done that. Oftentimes they're available online. Be sure that you follow the rules precisely.
If you fail to follow the rules to the letter, your entry may be disqualified. So let's take a quick look at what the rules have to say for our onions. And this is from the Missouri State Fair, and we are in the agriculture department, and we're in the horticulture section. So let's take a look at what our rules are for onions. Okay, so this is class 17 onions. Each entry must include 4 specimens of the same variety. Greens may be removed if the onions have been dried. Fresh specimens such as scallions should be submitted with the greens intact. Wow, there are some pretty good gift premiums for the winners. So I think it's worth putting a little effort into developing an award-winning entry. For an award-winning entry at the state fair, it's important that the vegetables be harvested and displayed at the proper stage of maturity. In general, that's the stage where they would normally be harvested. Now, in the case of our onions, that's pretty straightforward. We planted them early enough that the crop matured well in advance of the fair. We dug them, we dried them down, and we'll now hold them until time for the fair. But with vegetables that are more perishable, this can be a bit of a challenge because it's very important to time the planting dates of these vegetables so that they do mature around the date of the fair. The fair is just around the corner, and let's talk about preparing an award-winning entry. Now, it's important to get inside the judge's head if you want to have an award-winning entry. And a judge is typically interested in 4 things in each entry. And those things are, first of all, the condition of the vegetables in the entry. Secondly, they're going to be looking at the quality of the vegetables in the entry. The third thing they'll be interested in is the uniformity among the different pieces of produce that are in the entry. And finally, they want the vegetables in that entry to be typical of that particular cultivar and that particular vegetable. The first characteristic that a judge is interested in is quality. In other words, those vegetables should be in prime eating condition. Now, for something like onions, that's pretty straightforward. You wait till the onions are mature, you harvest them at the proper stage, you dry them down, and they're at their peak of quality. But it can be a bit more of a challenge with more perishable vegetables, and vegetables too that may not typically ripen when the fair is scheduled. Now, as far as quality, what the judge is looking at is shape, size, color. Obviously, a judge can't taste it, but by looking at it, it should be at a point where you can imagine how good that vegetable would taste if you were eating it. A characteristic that the judge is particularly interested in the entry is the condition of the vegetables. The vegetables should be, as harvested, they shouldn't appear to be scrubbed or otherwise cleaned, but there should be no soil adhering to them, and there should be no bruising or other damage. And if we take a look at these onions, we can compare and contrast an onion as it's harvested with an onion that's been groomed for entry in the fair. Now, it is important that certain standards be met. You know, for example, with onions, typically there's a short neck allowed on the onions that are in the entry, and the roots will be trimmed to about 1 inch in length. But it is important that the onions be properly dried down. And if we look at this onion here, for example, we have a bit of a problem in that the neck is still wet. And a discerning judge would notice this and downgrade that particular onion. The vegetables in an entry should be typical of that particular cultivar or type of vegetable. And this is a situation where size doesn't always win. You know, for example, you may have a few onions that are huge among your harvest, but if a more typical onion would be this size, then the entry should be onions of this size. Again, an informed judge will know that this is a bit abnormal, and this would be more typical of the cultivar. A judge is interested in uniformity among the vegetables in an entry. Now, when we talk about uniformity, we're talking about things such as shape, size, and color. Let's take a look at these onions here and see how we might have some issues with uniformity among the different onions that we have cleaned. First of all, let's take a look at size. And if we look at this large onion, it's a beautiful onion, but if we included it in an entry with this onion here, they're obviously the different sizes, and this is not a good example of uniformity. Another thing to consider, of course, is shape. And so here we have an onion that's somewhat flattened in nature, while this particular onion is more rounded. Again, not good examples of uniformity. And then a final thing to look at is color. Now, with red onions, we expect to see some variation in color. But for example, if we were to compare this onion with this onion here, we'll see definitely that they're not uniform in color. As we put together the particular entry, we want to pay special attention to uniformity among the vegetables that we choose for that entry. there's an aesthetic aspect to an award-winning entry at the fair. And certainly the judge is going to be thinking about quality, condition, uniformity, and typical of variety when judging, but they're also going to be looking for something that is attractive, something that is, at the peak of perfection, the award-winning blue ribbon display at the fair. And so we want to put some time and attention into properly preparing the vegetables that go into the entry. Now let's talk about actually preparing the entry for the fair. And this, of course, should be done just in advance of the day of judging. You don't want to do this too far in advance, because the more time you have between when you prepare the vegetables and actually exhibit it, the more time there is for them to lose quality or for there to become some issue related to condition. So the preparation of each vegetable will be unique to that vegetable, and let's talk about how we might prepare our red onions for display at the fair. Now, there are accepted standards from the standpoint of displaying an onion. Typically, the onion will be mature, and the tops will be allowed to have dried down. What we're going to do at this point is trim the tops back, and the standards typically allow for about 1 inch of top to be left on the onion. So we trim that back. The standards also allow for about 1 inch of roots to remain. Don't remove the roots entirely, because typically, again, the judge will want to see some evidence of roots on the onion. Now, vegetables for display should never appear scrubbed. They should never appear peeled. They should appear as they were harvested. But even so, we want to make sure that the vegetables in the display are clean. And so we can use a very soft brush and remove any adhering soil. Try not to actually wash vegetables for display, because that almost invariably results in an unnatural appearance on the vegetables. So we've removed all the dirt and debris with our soft brush. Now let's do a little bit of grooming to reveal the inner beauty of this particular onion. It's an accepted practice to remove some of the outer scales of the onion, the dried ones that are outer, but you don't want to go too deep, because then again the onion will have an unnatural peeled appearance. So we'll very carefully remove these outer scales. And then we'll, using our very soft brush again, we'll remove any more adhering soil. Want to be a little cautious here, because we don't want to tear those other scales. I see one more piece here to gently remove. And here is our onion as it's been groomed to include in the display. There may be a few more little things that we'll remove there. And there's our onion ready for the display. Let's compare and contrast a couple of onions that have been prepared for display. First of all, a good example. The outer peelings have been removed. This onion is as it would appear harvested from the garden. The neck is dry, and we've trimmed the roots to the proper length. We've also examined this onion closely, and we see no evidence of any blemishes. Here, on the other hand, is an onion that has been improperly prepared. First of all, the neck is still wet. You can see here as we squeeze that, and a knowledgeable judge will definitely downgrade that particular onion. Also, this onion has been peeled, and it has an unnatural appearance. Now, while this may be just the stage where you want to slice it to put it on a hamburger, this is not a good stage or a good appearance for this particular onion in a display at the fair. Notice also the roots have been removed. This is not considered a good thing either. And then finally, we have a blemish here at the base. So again, an example of an onion that is not ready for, or not a good candidate for display at the fair. Now let's actually put together the entry. Now, remembering back when we checked the premium book, an entry for onions includes 4 onions. And so our goal is to find 4 onions that are uniform, that are of good condition, that are of good quality, and that properly represent this particular type of onion. So we've groomed a number of onions down here at the table, and a good way to start in putting the entry together is to line these up in terms of size. So we'll do that here. And again, notice that we're handling these very carefully. We don't want to introduce any damage at this point. We're working on a towel so that we avoid damage because of that. And we'll continue to line up these onions by size. Okay, so now we've arranged them by size, and we can get a feel for uniformity from the standpoint of size. So that's a good place to start. Remembering that this particular onion is not a really large onion, it's not a really small onion, we might disqualify this huge onion here and this very small one here. So looking at what's left, we now want to find onions that are more or less typical from the standpoint of the shape. And so as we go through this, we're going to avoid any that might have an extremely flattened appearance, because this particular type of onion is more rounded. We also have one onion that obviously is not uniform from the standpoint of color, and that would be this onion right here. So we'll pull that one out as well. Now, taking a look at what's left, we have reasonable uniformity as far as size. We have a fairly good representation as far as the appearance, but let's look a little bit deeper. So if we look at these onions, we notice that this one has a bit of discoloration here, so we might set it out. This one here, even though it's a nice example, is noticeably smaller than the rest of the onions, so we'll set it out as well. Now, looking at what we have left, we can go through and make sure that we examine the entire onion to look for any obvious problems. We also want to smell each one of these onions to make sure that we don't have bulb rot. And so we'll go ahead and give it the sniff test. We'll smell each one of these. Okay, they're all good. We'll also check the necks to make sure that they've dried down, which they all have. Okay, so these are good candidates now to select the actual display. It's a good practice to have twice the number of vegetables that you actually need for the display. And that way you have a bit of backup if you accidentally drop a piece of produce while you're preparing the display at the fair, or if some other disaster happens. But looking at these 8 onions, we have really good potential material for an award-winning display. Now, we'll go ahead and select out the 4 that we really like for the display. Again, one more careful examination to make sure that there's no problems. Okay, so those will be the 4 that are the actual entry. These will be our backups here. One more quick look to make sure there's no obvious problems. What beautiful onions. Again, these onions are of peak quality. They're very uniform in shape and appearance and size. They are typical of this particular cultivar of onion, and the condition is fabulous. So we have the makings of an award-winning display. Well, it's time to head to the fair. So let's go ahead and pack these onions up very carefully to make sure that they make the trip in good condition. We want to, again, make sure that all the effort we've put into growing and handling and grooming these onions results in a beautiful display once we get to the fair. So we'll go ahead and put these in here, and I'm going to place a towel over the top to hold them in place so they won't roll around and damage each other. And now we're ready to head off to the fair. Now, I always bring some extra pieces of produce along with me, just in case there's some sort of disaster and I need to replace a piece of produce that's going to be in the display. But these onions that I've again gone through and I've grown well, I've properly dried them down, I properly selected them from the standpoint of size and quality and condition and uniformity, and a true or representative of that particular type of onion. These are going to be my display. The others, they're my backup. So I'll carefully transport these to the fair. I will follow all of the rules from the standpoint of being there on time to set up my display. And then typically the fair will provide the plate or the other item that will actually display the vegetables on. If that's not the case and I need to bring that myself, I will definitely do that as well. There'll also be rules about whether or not I can be present while the judging is taking place. In most cases, the people who provide the entry are not present when the judging takes place. In some cases, though, there may be an opportunity to visit with the judge after the judging. And that's always a good time to learn some of the tips and pointers from someone who's had experience looking at lots of different entries at the fair. So again, by thinking about growing good quality vegetables, handling them properly sorting them, properly preparing them, and properly preparing an award-winning display, it's a great way to show off your skill as a gardener and hopefully take home some of those premiums that are available for award-winning displays.